the struggle, work, and choices that made Amelia Earhart a pilot. Becoming a pilot wasn't something that simply happened. To Amelia Earhart, it wasn't offered to her, wrapped in encouragement or expectation. It was something she had to build herself, plank by plank, hour by hour, sacrifice by sacrifice. By the end of the First World War, Amelia had already felt the pull of something beyond an ordinary life. She'd worked as a nurse's aide in a military hospital where she'd seen pain, courage, and the weight of choices most people never face. But after the war ended, the question of what next hung heavy over her. Society quietly guided women back toward safe, predictable roles. But Amelia had already glimpsed that there was something else waiting, even if she didn't know yet what it was. She drifted for a time, trying different paths. She studied medicine briefly at Columbia University, driven by a desire to help. But her heart never quite settled there. Her health was fragile too. A long-standing sinus infection required surgery that left her exhausted and forced her to put school aside. It might have been an ending. For many, it would have been. But Amelia had learned early that disappointment could be a fork in the road rather than a wall. Then, in December 1920, a moment came that would change everything. While visiting an airfield in Long Beach, California, she paid $10 for a 10-minute flight in a yellow biplane. As the aircraft lifted off and the ground fell away, Amelia felt something inside her rise to meet the sky. The wind rushed around her, the horizon opened, and the familiar pull of gravity loosened its hold. By the time the plane touched down, her mind was no longer on the ground. By the time I had got 200 or 300 feet off the ground, she later wrote, I knew I had to fly. It wasn't just excitement, it was a quiet certainty. As though all the scattered pieces of her restlessness had snapped into place. But wanting to fly and becoming a pilot were two very different things. Especially for a woman in the early 1920s, lessons were expensive. And Amelia didn't come from wealth. Most flight instructors wouldn't even take female students seriously. Planes themselves were delicate machines built from canvas and wood, prone to mechanical failure and accidents. And beyond all that, there was the deeper barrier, the heavy, unspoken rule that women weren't supposed to fly at all. But Amelia wasn't the type to wait for permission. Instead, she made choices that showed where her heart truly was. She worked a series of jobs that had nothing to do with adventure or glory. She drove trucks. She worked as a photographer. She took stenography jobs, any work that paid anything, to fill the savings jar that slowly, painfully became her flying fund. When others might have spent what little they had on comfort or leisure, Amelia bought lessons. Every dollar she earned became a step closer to the cockpit. It was a decision made again and again, each early morning, each late night. Each time she turned down something easy in favor of what truly mattered to her. Her life became shaped by a single, unwavering intention to fly. In January 1921, she met Netta Snook, one of the very few female flight instructors in the country. Netta saw in Amelia not just curiosity but determination. Amelia wasn't content to sit quietly at the controls. She wanted to understand every detail. What each dial meant, what each sound in the engine might signal. Her mind and hands worked together, absorbing everything. The first time she sat in the pilot's seat, the plane felt almost alive beneath her. It rattled, shook, and strained, but instead of fear, Amelia felt focus sharpen inside her. The world below shrank away. Above, the sky opened wider than she'd ever imagined. Flight required not only courage but skill. There were crashes, close calls, mistakes that could have killed her. But Amelia accepted each one as part of the price of learning. The most effective way to do it, she would later say, is to do it. It wasn't a motto she discovered in comfort. It was forged in moments of sweat, doubt, and stubborn perseverance. After months of training and hundreds of small sacrifices, Amelia earned her pilot's license in 1921. Only the 16th woman in the United States to do so, but that small piece of paper wasn't the end. In truth, it was the beginning of something bigger, a declaration that she had chosen a life beyond the ordinary and she would keep choosing it. She wanted her own plane, but that meant an even greater sacrifice. She continued to live frugally, turning aside things that might have made life easier. When others saw a reckless indulgence, Amelia saw possibility. She bought a second-hand bright yellow Kinner Airster biplane, naming it the Canary. In it, she learned what it meant to master not just a machine, but also the winds, the weather, and most importantly, herself. Flying wasn't a glamorous escape. It was hours of studying charts, fixing engines, fighting nerves, and paying careful attention to every small warning sign. It was the risk of mechanical failure over empty fields. But Amelia found freedom not in ignoring the danger but in accepting it as part of the cost of living fully. She started setting small records, altitude, distance. Nothing world-shaking yet, but enough to carve her place among pilots. enough to prove to herself that she belonged in the sky as much as anyone and always. She carried with her the lessons she'd learned as a girl building homemade roller coasters, that failure hurts, but regret hurts more, that fear doesn't vanish, but courage can rise to meet it, and that if the path doesn't exist, you can build your own runway. The world still whispered that flying wasn't for women, but Amelia didn't shout back. She simply kept flying, each takeoff a quiet argument against doubt. In those years, she made choices few saw, the decision to wake before dawn to study maps and weather reports, the hours spent learning to repair her plane herself when money for mechanics ran out, the letters she wrote seeking sponsorships and support. Choices that, in themselves, looked ordinary but together formed something extraordinary. By the time the larger world noticed her, they saw a woman in a leather jacket, smiling calmly in front of a canvas-winged plane. What they didn't see were the years of sacrifice, the small, daily struggles, and the unshakable decisions that made her into that pilot. Amelia Earhart became a pilot not by waiting for the world to make space for her, but by carving her own space with every choice, every hour of work, and every refusal to accept that the sky was only meant for someone else. The years that followed Amelia Earhart's first license weren't marked by sudden fame or overnight transformation. They were built slowly and sometimes painfully out of choices that most people never saw. Choices that seemed small, turning down comfort, saving every dollar, keeping her promise to herself to keep flying no matter what. In those early mornings, when the grass was wet with dew and the engine hesitated before roaring to life, Amelia felt the same mix of fear and freedom. The fear never truly left her. It simply stopped being an enemy, it became part of the air she breathed. A reminder that flying wasn't guaranteed, and that every takeoff was a decision to rise above what seemed safe. In the Canary, she climbed higher than many thought possible, setting an unofficial women's altitude record of 14,000 feet. At that height, the air grew thin and cold, the engine's rattle seemed louder, and the ground fell away until it was no longer visible through the haze. But for Amelia, those moments held something precious, proof that the limits others saw were only lines drawn in fear. Yet even with her growing skill, she still faced doubt from those around her. Sponsors were scarce, the public fascination with Lady Flyers was laced with condescension. Many watched not to see her succeed, but to see if she would fail. But Amelia understood something most didn't: attention fades, but purpose endures. She used her limited fame not for applause, but as a lever to pull herself further toward the horizon. She gave lectures, wrote articles, and taught young women that daring wasn't something you inherited, it was something you practiced. Choice after choice, but the turning point came in 1928, when opportunity knocked in the most unexpected way. A publisher named George Putnam was involved in organizing an attempt to fly the first woman across the Atlantic Ocean. It wouldn't be as pilot, just as a passenger, sitting behind two male aviators, Bill Stultz and Slim Gordon. For some, it might have felt disappointing to cross an ocean without touching the controls. But Amelia saw further. She understood what it could mean: a chance to open doors not just for herself, but for all the women who dared to dream of the sky. She accepted the offer, knowing full well the risk of being labeled an inflated passenger. The flight was dangerous, the weather unpredictable, and the aircraft itself a lumbering, fuel-heavy machine compared to today's sleek designs. But she boarded with her trademark calm, bringing with her a notebook and her quiet determination. On June 17, 1928, the plane took off from Newfoundland, crossing into the endless stretch of gray water below. Hours blurred into each other, marked by cold, fatigue, and the sound of the engines vibrating through metal and bone. Amelia wrote in her log, even though she wasn't at the controls, she watched the horizon, felt the ship's movements, noted the changing weather, and kept her mind sharp. After over 20 hours in the air, they landed safely in Wales. Instantly, the world's attention turned to the tall, quietly spoken woman in trousers and a leather jacket. Headlines called her Lady Lindy, comparing her to Charles Lindbergh. But Amelia never pretended she had done what he had. She was honest about being only a passenger this time. Yet she understood the power of the moment. A woman had crossed the Atlantic by air. When she returned to America, crowds gathered to see her, to hear her speak. Flashes of cameras turned night into day, but behind the calm smile, Amelia felt the weight of unfinished business. Crossing the Atlantic as a passenger wasn't enough. She knew that true respect wouldn't come until she did it alone, by her own hands. Facing her own fear, rather than let fame define her, she used it to fuel her next steps. She wrote a book about the flight, not as a victory lap, but as a way to share the reality of aviation, its dangers, discipline, and promise. She began giving speeches across the country, not for vanity, but to remind others, especially women, That possibility begins when you refuse to accept the limits others place around you. At a time when most lady pilots were treated as novelties, Amelia earned the respect of seasoned flyers through relentless preparation. She kept studying weather patterns, navigation, and mechanics. She stayed late at airfields, asking questions most passengers never considered. When sponsorship deals came, she chose carefully, partnering only when it helped fund further flights. Never just for publicity, her personal life evolved too. George Putnam, the publisher who had organized her Atlantic flight, proposed marriage more than once before she finally accepted. Even then, she made her terms clear: she would remain free to pursue flying on her own terms, and they would always deal in honesty and mutual respect. It was a partnership rooted not in control but in shared purpose through it all. Amelia's vision stayed the same. Flight wasn't about spectacle, it was about proving that courage, skill, and persistence mattered more than gender, background, or the doubts of others. She once said, "The most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is merely tenacity." Those weren't just words for speeches. They were the way she lived each day. Then came the goal that would change everything: to become the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't just about fame. It was about claiming ownership of her own destiny, about finishing what had begun years earlier when she first felt the pull of the sky. Preparations were intense. Mechanics tuned and retuned the Lockheed Vega she would fly, a single-engine plane that offered little comfort and no forgiveness for mistakes. Weather forecasts were uncertain. The North Atlantic was a graveyard for even the most experienced pilots. But Amelia didn't let fear become a reason to stop. Instead, she let it sharpen her focus. On May 20, 1932, 5 years to the day after Lindbergh's solo flight, Amelia took off from Harbor Grace, Newfoundland. Alone in the cockpit, she faced icy winds, mechanical trouble, and moments when the horizon blurred into an unbroken wall of gray cloud. Icing threatened to bring the plane down. Exhaustion pressed on her eyelids, but beneath it all was the same unyielding thought: keep going. After 14 hours and 56 minutes, she landed in a pasture near Londonderry, Northern Ireland. She had done it, the first woman and only the second person ever to fly solo, non-stop, across the Atlantic. In that moment, Amelia Earhart became something more than a pilot. She became living proof that determination can redraw the map of what's possible.